I knew the moment my own child looked at me with entitlement instead of love that something inside my life had quietly cracked. It was not a loud moment, not a shouted accusation or a slammed door, but a single command that stripped away years of sacrifice. In that instant, I realized how easily devotion can be twisted and how quickly a home can turn into a place where you are no longer seen. What followed was not just heartbreak, but a reckoning, a journey that forced me to face the truth I had avoided for far too long. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let us begin. I wake before the sun most mornings, listening to the soft clink of halyards against the masts in Rockport Harbor. The sound carries across the water and slips through my bedroom window like an old ritual calling me upright. I rise slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in my knees, and run my palm along the faded pine railing I sanded myself during a brutal winter years ago. The house remembers every season, and sometimes I think it remembers me even better than I remember myself. I head to the kitchen and brew strong coffee, letting the scent settle through the rooms the way it always has, comforting and steady, like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Whitfield House was not much when I bought it in 2009, just after the economic crash left prices low and the future uncertain. The roof leaked in 3 places, the basement smelled like wet cardboard, and the front porch sagged as if bracing for bad news. But I saw something honest in its bones. I spent months repairing it room by room, pulling out rotten beams, painting walls by hand, and learning more about lumber moisture than any widow should have to learn. I kept every receipt, every inspection note, and every photograph marking the slow transformation from fragile structure to shelter. I suppose rebuilding the house helped me rebuild myself after losing my husband, turning grief into something useful. Most days follow a quiet rhythm now. I drink my coffee by the window, then tend the small garden behind the shed where beans climb twine and mint refuses to die. Some afternoons I bake blueberry bread and carry slices to neighbors who are too old to stand at a stove. Once a week, I open my living room to a handful of retired teachers and fishermen who like to read poetry aloud. I do not need parties or noise. I just need the simple hum of a life that fits my hands. Everything shifted when my son Daniel and his wife Brooke moved in temporarily. Their apartment in Portland was under renovation, and I agreed they could stay until it was finished. Daniel carries the restless energy of someone who works too much and sleeps too little. He walks around with earbuds in, half present, and half drifting somewhere inside spreadsheets. Brooke, on the other hand, sees the world as a series of staged moments. She talks about lighting, angles, and something she calls modern coastal style. The first evening she stepped into my living room, she scanned the shelves of sea glass and old books with a faint smile that felt like judgment. I notice how the house reacts to them. The rooms feel tighter, the quiet less certain. Brooke rearranges small things without asking, nudging my antique biscuit tin aside so her white ceramic bowl can shine brighter in the photographs. Daniel tries not to get caught between us, but his silence travels farther than any argument could. Still, when I walk through the kitchen, I think of the afternoons my husband and I spent sanding the butcher block counter until it glowed. When I cross the living room floor, I hear the echoes of our laughter as we hammered boards back into shape. The shed behind the house still holds the tools he labeled with neat handwriting, and the scent of cedar makes my chest tumble. in a way that feels both painful and grounding. Rockport enters autumn slowly, the air sharpening while the harbor grows quiet. Visitors drift away, and the gulls circle wider arcs over the water. I sense a shift in the house as well, a subtle pressure in the walls, as if the wood itself knows change is coming. But for now, I breathe with it. I let the wind through the window remind me that even the calmest shore can hide a sudden storm. If you are still watching, and this opening stirred something in you, please comment number 1 below to let me know you are with me. Now, let us move on to chapter 2. The late afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window in a thin, cool sheet, the kind that makes every surface look slightly more fragile than it truly is. I had just come in from the garden, brushing soil from my hands, planning to start dinner the way I always did at this hour. The house felt quiet at first, the sort of quiet that used to calm me, but lately it carried an edge I could not quite name. My muscles held a faint tension, something like the body remembering a bruise before it forms. While I rinsed my hands under the tap, I heard Brooke's footsteps in the hallway, quick and certain. She entered the kitchen with a glossy sheet of paper in her hand, and without greeting or explanation, she pressed it onto the surface of my refrigerator. The magnet clicked loudly, as if sealing a verdict. When I turned, I saw a printed schedule, color-coded and laminated, dividing chores and household tasks by day and hour. My name filled nearly every block. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, even small maintenance tasks were listed like obligations owed. Brooke smoothed the corners of the page with a sense of satisfaction. She said one short sentence about wanting the house to run in a more structured way, especially since her friends sometimes stopped by and liked taking photographs in attractive spaces. Her tone was airy, but the implication was not. She saw the house as a backdrop, and me as part of the machinery needed to keep her world presentable. I felt my throat tighten, not from surprise, but from the slow confirmation of something I had tried not to admit. Daniel wandered in moments later, glancing at the schedule while reaching for a glass. His shoulders sagged slightly, the only sign he registered the discomfort in the room. "I will talk to Brooke later," he murmured, and the strain in his voice was so faint it could have dissolved in the running faucet. He left the kitchen before I could answer, slipping into the habit he knew best, avoiding the moment when it mattered most. Brooke, oblivious or indifferent, shifted quickly into talk about renovation possibilities. She drifted through the kitchen, pointing at walls she wanted to remove, shelves she planned to replace, colors she considered too dated to keep. She spoke of ripping out cabinets, installing a minimalist island, turning my wooden floors white. When I mentioned that any major renovations required permits from the town office, she laughed lightly and said, "Everyone knows everyone here." "It will be fine." Her confidence was not comforting. It was presumptuous, and it pressed into the space between us like a sharp object. After she left, I noticed a small pile near the mudroom door. A few of my belongings sat wrapped in brown paper and twine, tagged for a donation box. On top was the frame holding my wedding photograph, tucked away as if it no longer belonged in the home I had built with my own hands. I unwrapped it slowly, feeling the shiver of indignation rise through me. The gesture was small enough to ignore, but intimate enough to wound. Later, while sorting the mailbox by the kitchen table, I found a brightly printed advertisement for a reverse mortgage company. I barely glanced at it before tossing it aside, not sensing yet how it would circle back into my life. At the time, it was just another piece of unwanted mail. As evening settled, I climbed the stairs, pausing to touch the carved notch my husband once made on the banister while measuring the height of a shelf. The wood felt cool beneath my fingertips. I opened the drawer of my bedside table and checked the folder holding my property documents, sliding it back into the safe with deliberate care. Downstairs, the wind began to whistle against the siding, slipping through a seam like a whispered warning. Standing alone in the dim hallway, I understood that something quiet and steady inside my home had shifted, and the air felt thinner for it. If you are still watching and the tension is drawing you in, please comment number 2 below so I know you are following this journey. Now, let us continue to chapter 3. I still remember the heaviness of that evening, the way the house felt too quiet after dinner, as if it were holding its breath along with me. The scent of roasted chicken still lingered in the air, but it could not disguise the tension that had settled into every corner. I stood at the kitchen counter, stacking plates, trying to move slowly so my hands would not betray the tremor creeping into them. Behind me, I sensed Daniel and Brooke exchange a silent signal, the kind couples make when they believe they are united in something larger than simple conversation. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice came out tight, as though he had practiced the words, but still struggled to release them. He told me that Brooke felt overwhelmed, that the house was becoming chaotic, and that something needed to change. Then he said what he had clearly rehearsed. I still hear it sometimes when the nights are too long and my mind is restless. He said I had to either do everything Brooke asked without question, or I had to leave the house. He said it without anger, as if he were making a practical decision, but the calmness made the blow land even harder. I kept my back turned at first. It was easier to look at the plates than at my son while he erased my place in his life. When I finally turned around, Brooke stood slightly behind him, her expression smoothed into something polite but victorious. She held a folder in her hand. Inside it were legal documents that would grant Daniel full authority over my financial decisions. She described it as a simple precaution, something many older people appreciate, using a tone soaked in sugar that felt almost mocking. Daniel did not look at me. His silence told me that this had already been discussed, planned, and agreed upon. I asked very quietly why this was necessary. Brooke answered before Daniel could, saying that managing a house and finances required clarity and structure. She talked about responsibility, efficiency, and modern systems, as though I were an outdated appliance holding them back. Daniel only nodded along, and that nod wounded me more than any words could have. While they waited for my reaction, something inside me shifted. It was not rage. It was a strange, settling stillness, as if my heart recognized what my mind was not ready to accept. I went back to cleaning, not to avoid the moment, but to steady myself. Wiping the kitchen table gave me time to think and breathe. Folding my embroidered kitchen towel and placing it deep in the drawer felt like claiming a small piece of myself that they could not touch. Later that night, when the house was dark and their footsteps upstairs had gone quiet, I sat in my small office and wrote everything down, every sentence spoken, every expression, every detail. I recorded the date and the time. The habit of documenting things had always helped me stay centered, and now it served as a way to keep my thoughts clear. I realized that if they were preparing to move against me, I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The following morning, before dawn, I drove to St. Brendan Church. The sanctuary smelled of old wood and melted wax, a place where the world's noise softened. Reverend May looked at me only once before guiding me to her office. She did not require a long explanation. She saw the truth in my face. Without delay, she called her friend, Attorney Harriet Sloan, someone known for protecting those who had been quietly cornered. As I sat there, listening to the soft hum of the old ceiling fan, memories of the years after my husband died rose inside me. The winters when my hands cracked from sanding floors, the nights when the smell of fresh paint kept me awake, the countless hours spent restoring the house board by board. I had rebuilt my life from pieces. I could do it again. When I walked out of the church, the sun was barely rising, but I felt as if I had stepped into a different light. Daniel had given his ultimatum, but I was no longer the woman who would fold under it. A storm was coming, but this time I was ready to meet it with both feet planted firmly on the ground. If you are still watching and the story is hitting deeper than expected, please comment number 3 below to show me you are still here. Now, let us step into chapter 4. The morning after Daniel delivered his ultimatum, I woke with the sense that the air inside the house had changed. It was the same structure, the same familiar walls I had worked on for years, but something in the center of it had shifted. The rooms felt heavier, as if the night had settled inside them and refused to leave. I moved slowly through the hallway, touching the banister, grounding myself, reminding myself that whatever was happening, I was still standing in the home I had rebuilt from the ruins of my early widowhood. Daniel was already at the breakfast table when I entered the kitchen. The faint smell of coffee drifted upward, and for a moment, I stood there simply watching him. He looked tired, as if the weight of the previous evening had landed on him as well, but the expression on his face was guarded. I approached him with caution, choosing my words carefully, hoping that goodwill and patience could still pull us back from the cliff. I tried to explain that the household did not need rigid rules or ultimatums, that we could talk things through the way we once did. His eyes softened for a moment, but then he looked away, and I saw the invisible wall Brooke had built around him. Before I could continue, Brooke entered the room. She carried herself with a polished calm, her tone overly gentle, as if she believed that softness could disguise control. She reminded both of us of the new structure she believed the house needed. She spoke about harmony, efficiency, and stability, but each word was a thin veil over the idea that I had already failed to measure up to her standards. She stood close to Daniel, a physical reminder that every decision he made now passed through her first. When our eyes met, hers were steady, almost certain, as if she knew she had already won the round. Despite the tension, I made a deliberate effort throughout the day to reclaim some sense of peace. I prepared a warm dinner with care, arranging the table the way I used to when the house felt alive. I dusted the shelves, tended to the plants in the sunroom, and placed a vase of fresh flowers near the living room window. I hoped that small gestures might soften the edges between us. Instead, Brooke walked from room to room, assessing everything with a critical eye. The flowers were too bright. The dishes were outdated. The blanket I folded on the couch disrupted her idea of clean lines. Daniel remained silent, absorbing her judgments the way dry soil absorbs water. Later in the afternoon, I slipped out to the workshop behind the house. It had always been my sanctuary, the place where I repaired furniture and kept remnants of my late husband's tools. Stepping inside, I felt an immediate ache. Boxes had been rearranged, labeled, and pushed into corners without my knowledge. Several items were stacked in a way that suggested they were being prepared for removal. My hands tightened as I walked through the narrow aisles, recognizing the violation of a space that had once been entirely mine. Someone had entered this room and tried to reorder my life without permission. I spent the next hour gathering the tools that mattered most, placing them in sturdy containers, labeling them with my own handwriting. It was a small act of resistance, but it steadied me. When Brooke appeared at the doorway, her expression unreadable, I continued working without looking up. Whatever she saw in that moment, she did not comment on it, but her silence carried a quiet challenge. That evening, I called Reverend May and Attorney Harriet. I explained the intrusion into the workshop and the shifting dynamic inside the house. Harriet encouraged me to keep documenting every detail, every alteration, every attempt to pressure me. Reverend May spoke to me with the warmth of someone who understood long battles and quiet endurance. Her words anchored me more than she knew. When I went to bed that night, my efforts at reconciliation had failed, but something sharper had taken root within me. I no longer felt the confusion of the previous day. Instead, a growing clarity settled in my chest. I understood now that this conflict was not temporary. Whatever came next, I would meet it with a steady hand. If you are still watching and each turn is keeping you hooked, please comment number 4 below to let me know you are staying with the story. Now, let us move forward to chapter 5. The tension inside the house had grown so thick by the end of the week that even the air felt sharpened by it. I moved through the room sensing a kind of choreography between Brooke and Daniel, as if they were preparing for something they believed they had the right to execute. Small signs appeared everywhere, sticky notes with tasks written in Brooke's narrow handwriting. New schedules pinned above the kitchen desk. A clipboard left on the counter as if the house had quietly transformed into a project site. Each detail told me that a larger move was forming behind the curtain. Late one afternoon, while I was downstairs folding linens, I heard a sound that made the back of my neck tighten. It was the familiar scrape of a drawer being pulled open, but it came from my bedroom upstairs. A slow, measured pull, then a pause, then another. My heartbeat grew heavier with each second. The sense of intrusion was so strong that I moved up the staircase without thinking, each step filled with a dread that felt both new and inevitable. When I reached the doorway, I saw Brooke standing beside my dresser, her hands inside my drawer, as if she had every right to be there. Papers were spread across the bedspread, including financial statements, property tax documents, and personal letters I had kept since my husband passed. She looked up at me with a calmness that felt colder than anger. She said she was organizing important paperwork to prevent future issues. Her tone suggested she believed her behavior was not only acceptable, but necessary. Before I could answer, Daniel entered the room. He did not ask what happened. He did not look at the scattered papers with confusion or concern. Instead, he positioned himself next to Brooke, creating a united front that pressed all the air out of the room. He said they wanted to make sure everything was managed responsibly. The implication was clear. They believed I could no longer manage my own life. Watching my son speak to me from a place so far away, a place shaped by someone else's voice, stung with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of me. Then Brooke announced their next step. They intended to move me into the small room near the basement, framing it as a practical adjustment that would make the house more functional. My own bedroom, the space I had painted with my late husband, the room where every piece of wood trim held a story, was going to be restructured. The message beneath her words was unmistakable. They were pushing me out of the center of my home, inch by inch, both physically and symbolically. Something hardened inside me then. For the first time, I said no with a strength I did not know I still possessed. The word cut the air like a blade. Daniel responded with shock and then frustration, his voice rising in disappointment. He accused me of resisting every attempt they made to help. The tension in the room flared, turning us into 3 immovable points locked in conflict. That was when Brooke revealed the final blow. She said an appraiser had visited the house earlier that morning while I was away. The assessment was complete. She stated it as casually as one might mention a weather report. My stomach tightened as the meaning settled in. They were not only reorganizing my life, they were preparing to claim the house itself. I gathered the scattered documents, placed them into my safe, and locked it with decisive clarity. I told both of them that any further discussion involving the property would occur only in the presence of my attorney. The air froze. The balance of the room shifted. For the first time, they seemed startled. Later, I called Harriet Sloan and explained everything. She listened without interruption, and when I finished, she told me in steady terms that this was no longer a family dispute. It was a deliberate attempt at asset control. I ended the night standing in my bedroom, staring at the drawers Brooke had forced open. I felt the weight of betrayal, but beneath it ran a deeper current. I knew now that the days ahead would demand a different version of me, and I was ready to meet her. Night settled over the house like a heavy cloth, muting every sound but amplifying the tension left behind from the confrontation earlier that day. I sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed I had shared with my late husband, and tried to slow the uneven rhythm of my breath. The walls still carried the echo of raised voices and accusations, and the air felt bruised from everything spoken and unspoken. I knew something irreversible had taken place. I could feel it in my bones, as clearly as the winter wind that sometimes slipped through the old window frames. The betrayal sat like a stone in my chest. It was not only that Daniel had stood with Brooke, it was that he had accepted the belief that I was someone who needed to be managed, relocated, and stripped of authority. I closed my eyes and let the memories drift forward without resistance. I saw the early years after my husband died, when the bills were stacked like towers on the kitchen table. I saw the long evenings sanding the floors, brushing away dust so Daniel could have a clean place to play. I saw myself repairing the porch steps alone, lifting beams heavier than anything I had ever touched before. I had built our life board by board, sacrifice by sacrifice. Now the child I had raised through every storm saw me as a burden to be handled. The next morning, I met attorney Harriet Sloan. Whether she arrived at my house or I visited her office hardly mattered, because the feeling was the same. I was stepping into another world. Harriet listened carefully as I described the invasion of my room, the threat of being moved to the basement space, and the revelation that the house had already been appraised without my knowledge. She did not interrupt. She did not soften her expression. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and told me plainly that I had two paths. The first was to yield to Daniel and Brooke in the hope that peace might return. The second was to defend myself through the law, accepting that the fracture between us might never heal. Then Harriet shared something I had not known. The appraisal company had reported that a second request had been made for the official documents, and the address provided did not match mine. It matched one of Brooke's private mailing addresses. The realization struck with a clarity that wiped away the lingering haze of hope. Brooke was not simply influencing Daniel. She was directing the entire campaign from the shadows. When I left Harriet's office, I sat in my car for several minutes, letting the silence fill me. I thought of Daniel as a bitey, sitting on my lap after scraping his knee. I thought of the nights I stayed awake during his fevers, counting his breaths. I thought of every moment when I believed love alone could protect us both. But love could not protect me now. Love was the very weapon being turned against me, used to blind me, used to weaken me. I returned to Harriet and signed the documents granting her authority to act on my behalf when needed. The pen did not shake in my hand. It felt like placing a final piece into a structure I had been unknowingly building for months. It was not vengeance. It was survival. Harriet instructed me to gather every important document and secure them in a protected location outside the house. That afternoon, I opened the drawers Brooke had rifled through and removed the folders one by one. Birth certificates, tax statements, insurance records, the deed to the house. I placed everything into a locked case and drove to the bank. As I stood inside the vault room, the cool air of the metal walls steadied me. I knew I had crossed a threshold. When I returned home that evening, the lights in the living room glowed softly. Through the window, I could see Daniel and Brooke sitting side by side, unaware of the decision I had made. I paused at the door and felt the weight of the moment settle fully into me. The next steps would reshape everything. The quiet life I had protected for decades was gone. I had made my choice, and there was no road back. If you are still watching and feeling the pressure of this turning point, please comment number 6 below to let me know you are right here with me. Now, let us continue with Chapter 7. When I returned home after meeting with attorney Harriet, The house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves were leaning back to watch what would unfold next. I paused inside the doorway, letting the quiet settle against my skin. Even the familiar scent of pine cleaner felt foreign now. Something intangible had shifted. Daniel and Brooke sensed it too, although neither of them knew exactly what I had done. But they could feel the difference in me, just as I could feel the change in them. Daniel passed me in the hallway that evening without lifting his eyes. He muttered a brief greeting before moving toward the kitchen, shoulders tense, steps clipped and uneven. There was no warmth left in his voice, only a distant politeness that struck deeper than open hostility. It reminded me of someone trying to perform a role without understanding the script. Every interaction with him now left me with a quiet ache that settled low in my chest. Brooke was far less subtle. She moved through the house with an air of sharpened efficiency, touching every surface, rearranging every item, adjusting the atmosphere to suit her vision. Overnight, she had placed a new list of house guidelines on the refrigerator, written in her neat, slanted handwriting. She changed the position of the furniture in the living room. She even replaced a fruit bowl on the counter with one made of glass and chrome, explaining that it had a cleaner aesthetic. Not once did she ask whether these spaces meant anything to me. They had become hers to refine, hers to command. The next morning, I tried to open the home Wi-Fi network to send documents to Harriet, only to discover that the password had been changed. When I asked about it, Brooke answered calmly that it was for security reasons. Her tone made it clear she considered the decision final. I felt a faint tremor beneath the quiet anger rising within me. The house was no longer a shared space. It was a territory she believed she had already conquered. But nothing prepared me for the moment when a stranger rang the doorbell in the early afternoon. A man in a clean uniform stood on the porch, carrying a clipboard and a small tablet. He explained that he was from an elder care evaluation service and that he had been asked to assess my ability to live independently. For a moment, I could not speak. A wave of shock washed through me so suddenly, I felt the air leave my lungs. I asked who had made the request. He gave a name. It was Brooks. The man was polite, almost apologetic, but the damage was already done. Someone had planted the idea that I was declining, that I might not be capable of protecting myself or my home. I told him firmly that I had not asked for an evaluation and would not be participating in one. He nodded, made a few notes, and promised to update the file. The word file lingered in my mind long after he left, a seed planted in soil I had not agreed to provide. I called Harriet immediately. She listened in silence, then told me that Brooke was escalating her strategy. The elder care evaluation was likely an attempt to build a case that I was no longer competent. Harriet urged me to document everything, lock my doors at night, and avoid leaving any personal papers unsecured. Her voice carried no fear, only urgency. As evening settled, I stood near the living room doorway and watched Daniel and Brooke sitting together on the couch. They looked comfortable, unified, and utterly separate from me. The realization that my own son now saw me through Brooke's lens was a wound I could not express. It throbbed beneath my ribs, heavy and sharp, refusing to fade. That night, I sat alone in my small office, surrounding myself with the folders, notes, and the quiet proof of everything that had transpired. I read Harriet's messages again, reminding myself of the steps still ahead of me. My hands shook only once before becoming steady again. I understood something then, with absolute clarity. I might lose Daniel. I might lose the illusion of family I had tried so hard to keep alive. But I would not lose myself, and I would not lose the home I had built. The cost of survival was becoming visible. I accepted it. I woke up in the guest room of Sylvia Matthews' small apartment, a gentle morning light spilling across the quilt she had placed at the foot of the bed. The quiet in that room felt almost unnatural after the tension that had filled every corner of my house on Lexington Avenue. For the first time in weeks, I was not listening for footsteps, voices, or the sharp sound of someone criticizing the way I lived. The silence felt heavy but necessary. It gave me space to sit with the truth I had spent years avoiding. During those first days, I barely spoke. I moved slowly around the apartment, washing my cup after breakfast, folding the blanket every morning, taking short walks through the neighborhood. With each passing hour, a sense of distance grew between me and the chaos I had left behind. Without Hannah's constant disapproval and Ethan's impatience, I began to recognize how exhausted I had become. I realized that freedom sometimes arrives quietly, without celebration, disguised as emptiness. One afternoon, Sylvia sat across from me at the small kitchen table and went over the legal documents again. She explained the importance of each signature and every notarized page. I listened carefully, letting the clarity sink in. The house was legally protected. My work, the years I had poured into building a foundation for my son, could no longer be taken from me. Hearing Sylvia speak so plainly made me understand how much of my life had been spent absorbing instead of defending. Her steady voice reminded me that it was not too late to reclaim the parts of myself I had allowed to fade. As the hours passed, I began seeing my situation without the blur of emotion. I saw how long I had stayed silent, how deeply I had feared losing Ethan, and how those fears had allowed someone else to shape my life for me. In the quiet of that apartment, I recognized a truth I had ignored. Love does not excuse mistreatment, and devotion cannot replace boundaries. For nearly a week, Ethan said nothing. Not a message, not a call. The silence hurt more than I expected, but it also showed me who was willing to face consequences and who was not. I did not wait for him to apologize. I simply watched to see if he would attempt to understand. Then the neighbors began calling, describing the disorder unfolding in the home I had left. The high bills, the unfinished chores, the mounting frustrations. Their stories did not bring satisfaction, only confirmation of what I already knew. My absence had revealed every invisible task I had carried alone. In the middle of all this, I started shaping a life of my own. I walked in the park each morning, brewed coffee slowly, wrote in a small notebook Sylvia had given me. Little by little, the heaviness lifted. When the first message from Ethan finally appeared on my phone, I did not open it. I simply looked at the screen glowing on the table and felt something shift inside me. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was the beginning of a path forward, one I would walk carefully on my own terms. If you are still watching and sensing the shift toward resolution, please comment number 8 below so I know you are still following. Now, let us move into the final chapter of this story. I arrived at the small cafe near Central Park much earlier than the time I had given Ethan. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, turning the room a soft amber. I chose a table by the glass wall where I could watch people pass by with scarves wrapped around their necks and hands tucked into pockets. The quiet hum of the cafe steadied my breath. I did not come seeking comfort. I came seeking closure. When Ethan finally walked in, I almost did not recognize him. His shoulders curved inward, his face looked pale, and his eyes carried a weight that had not been there before. His shirt was wrinkled, and there was a tired slump to his steps. For a moment, he simply stood there, searching for the courage to walk toward me. I did not move. I waited, letting him choose to face what he had done. He sat down, gripping the edge of the table as if holding himself together. His voice trembled as he tried to explain the weeks without me. The house had become chaotic. Bills rose faster than he expected. Hannah had left after blaming him for everything. His job had been put at risk. He said each detail slowly, as though the words themselves were heavy to carry. I listened without interrupting, not out of detachment, but because it was the first time he had spoken to me with honesty instead of authority. When he finally grew silent, I told him the truth with a calm I had not felt before. The house would remain with the charity organization. The documents would not change. He had 15 days left to move out. I spoke not with anger, but with certainty. These were boundaries I should have set long ago. Ethan lowered his head. He did not fight it. He said he only hoped for a chance to rebuild something with me, even if it took years. When he reached out to hold me, his tears fell freely. I allowed myself a few tears as well, not from hurt, but from release. As I left the cafe, the air felt lighter. The ending had arrived, and with it, the first quiet shape of a new beginning. I woke in the quiet of my new apartment, a place chosen by my own hand and not imposed by anyone else. Morning light spread across the bare walls, soft and clean, and for the first time in a long while, I felt as if the air itself welcomed me. The rooms were small, but they carried no tension and no demands. Every object inside belonged to me alone, every corner shaped by my decisions rather than someone else's expectations. As I made a cup of coffee, I let the steam rise and thought about the long path that had pushed me here. I remembered the silent injuries I had endured, the moments when I had swallowed my own voice, and the way my fear of losing Ethan had kept me in a place where my worth was overlooked. Standing in this small kitchen, I understood that survival had required me to walk away, not as an act of abandonment, but as an act of clarity. The letter from the charity organization sat on my counter. They called the donation of my home a gesture of dignity. Reading those words filled me with a calm sense of purpose. Something good would rise from what had been broken. Ethan messaged more often now, short, careful notes. I answered with the same calm pace. Time needed to work where apology alone could not reach. Later, I stepped onto the balcony. The breeze carried the scent of trees, light and steady. I realized that I had not lost my son. I had only lost the belief that love required silence. In this quiet space, I chose myself. And that choice became the beginning of everything else. In the quiet that follows a long struggle, there is a moment when a person finally recognizes that strength is not measured by how much they endure, but by the courage it takes to step away from what diminishes their spirit. Healing often begins in stillness, where boundaries become acts of self-respect, and the future stops feeling like a door that will never open. Dignity, once reclaimed, grows into a quiet and steady form of power, shaping a life built on clarity instead of fear, and reconciliation, when it arrives, becomes meaningful only because it no longer asks anyone to shrink themselves to belong. Thank you for traveling through this story. If any part of it stirred something in you, I would truly value your thoughts. Your reflections and your presence help keep this space alive. Please consider commenting, subscribing, and following so you can stay connected to what comes next.